So without further ado, let me introduce my colleague who's sitting right here at the table with me. I'm joined by Charles Dahan. And Charles, just to give you a little bit of background about his expertise, he's a research fellow and PhD candidate in the University of Florida's Political Science Department. He specializes in behavioral psychology, behavioral economics, and public opinion. He's published in a wide range of peer-reviewed and industry publications and helps associations, companies, and member organizations define and achieve their goals through utilizing rigorous and quantitative research. And this, of course, is one of the main reasons we are excited to invite Charles to give a presentation on board engagement with us today, because he, I think, very cleverly has come up with a way for us to measure board engagement. And so we're going to be talking about that today. Charles has received multiple research grants, including serving as the 2015-2016 Innovation Researcher for the American Society of Association Executives, with a nationwide series of focus groups and survey research to help associations identify and train effective leaders while quantifying member and leader engagement. And I think that's also a reason we're very excited to have Charles with us, because of the large number of association clients and other nonprofit organizations that are here on the phone with us today. His broad research agenda has a singular focus: what variables affect how and why individuals engage in healthy, positive, and collaborative behaviors. This academic research informs a puzzle for businesses. What is engagement? How can organizations increase their efficacy, productivity, and member satisfaction? Charles, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. That was very kind of you. Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be able to share my own research and some of the findings that we have to attempt to really quantify this somewhat vague term that is engagement, what it means, and how this quantification can really be useful for associations. And it's work I've done for a while, both through the ASAE grant and directly with a number of associations. So I'm very excited to be able to offer that.
Thank you so much. And for those of you playing along on a home game, I probably should have introduced myself. This voice you may recognize is Dottie Schindlinger. I'm BoardEffect's Governance Technology Evangelist, also the star of many of our videos, so you probably recognize my voice and may think, oh gosh, not her again. But at any rate, Charles and I share something in common, which is that we are both kind of governance nerds, if you will. We're really interested in this idea of understanding what makes board engagement tick. And what helps someone be really deeply engaged in a mission and deeply engaged in specific work. And so I'm just really excited to have Charles share some of the things that he's learned with us today. So I'm going to turn it over to Charles to give a little bit of a brief presentation, and then we're going to have a bit of a conversation after that. So go ahead and take it away, Charles.
Sure. So there are three goals for today's webinar. The first is to define engagement. We're going to do this in three different ways, so three different types of engagement, and really define it to attempt to get a mindset and wrap our heads around what engagement actually means. The second is to change that mindset and really define what social capital or trust within association means and how we can maximize it, and the relationship between this mindset and our definition and quantification of engagement. Third, I'm going to offer suggestions for measuring engagement, so you can walk away from the presentation with some tangible tips for measuring different types of engagement within your own association or organization or nonprofit. So there are three types of engagement, and we're going to go over ways to quantify these. And the first is psychological engagement. The second is tangible engagement, which is usually what we think of as our goal. And the third is professional engagement. And each of these relates to building social capital within your association or organization, and relates to building trust. And the goal then today is to be able to figure out how we can quantify and measure and then increase these types of engagement and really maximize them in order to maximize trust, in order to maximize what social capital is, we're going to define in a second, and then be able to really improve and strengthen your association. So what is this term I'm referring to as social capital? Well, social capital is a term that's in both sort of popular and academic literature, and the real definition is trust. So what we want to build within the association or the organization, I'll use the term organization as a catch-all for all the different types of folks that are on the line. So the reason why we want to build trust is it's going to make things more efficient. And by things, I mean it's going to make cooperation and collaboration more efficient, and it's going to really maximize the ability of an organization to function and to really strengthen it. So trust for members of the association or the organization would be they have trust in the board. So they have a belief that the board is going to be efficient and has their best interests in mind. The benefits of that, again, are increased efficiency and increased participation by members. So what's the first type of engagement? The first type of engagement is psychological engagement. And this is the relationship an individual believes they hold towards the organization. So oftentimes we think about psychological engagement as warmth. So how warm do I feel towards my organization, and therefore how engaged in a psychological manner might I be with the association or the organization. And we can measure this using surveys. So there are two different types of measurement tools we're going to use. One is what I would refer to as invasive, which means we have to force people to tell us what they think, and we ask them questions using surveys. And this is okay, and it's the way in which we're going to measure warmth psychologically. And so how do we measure this? It's participation in activities without a real personal benefit. And so what's the benefit of knowing that we can leverage regarding psychological engagement? Well, it's that over time we can correlate the warmth somebody feels towards the organization with their participation in other ways. So if our goal is to maximize tangible investment, which we'll go over in a second, if our goal is to maximize that, what we want to do is be able to correlate psychological engagement or warmth over time with that tangible investment. So let's talk about tangible investment for a second. It's the intensity of participation. And we can think about this in two ways: the amount of time somebody devotes to the association and the amount of resources or money or attendance or donation that they devote to the organization. And this is really important because it's the lifeblood of the organization. And we can measure this with non-invasive measures, things like software, for example. So we can look at email software, and we can see whether or not people opened our emails. We can look at whether or not whether or not board members opened board materials. And this is great because it's a behavioral measure without having to ask people, and they might not tell us, they might not remember the answer, right? They might feel warmer, for example, towards the organization on a Monday than they do on a Tuesday. It's variable. They might be ambivalent, right? But if we have a non-invasive measure that we can then correlate with the survey data, we can figure out patterns and the sorts of behaviors that we can really encourage to maximize these tangible investments. So one caveat and things that we want to measure is that an association or organization wants to meet member needs. And one example of that are magazine members. These are folks who subscribe to, who join the association, who subscribe to the magazine and don't really participate in any other way. But what we want to do, and these are good members, you have to have these within the association, particularly if we view them not as free riders or people that are getting more than they're giving, because we want people to give more than the tangible resources we give them as the elites within the association. But what we want to be able to highlight with these magazine members is to take them along a pathway to increase their involvement. So we want to provide the level of resources that members desire, not just what we think are best for these, in order to encourage future participation. Professional engagement. And these are folks who are they're investing in two different types, which means they're going to consume resources like money or time to these sorts of activities, but in the end they're doing it for their own individual development. And second are group development. The second is group development. So participation in conferences or leadership groups, networking groups, mentoring. So these are people that are going to engage in activities that are devoted to the development, the leadership skills, and the social network of the organization. So what are some examples of this? Well, it might be hours committed, and it can be a tangible investment, which is hours committed to the association's mission, or a professional engagement, hours committed to consuming knowledge and information. It might be attendance. And again, these are things we can hopefully measure in behavioral terms rather than survey terms. Third is resource consumption. And this is really important for board members, because we want to have informed board members and people that not only are active in terms of voting or attending board meetings, but they're really knowledgeable. And therefore, they're more likely to collaborate. If I go into a meeting and I'm completely unprepared, I'm probably going to be more likely to be silent and not collaborate. But we want to measure the resources people consume, and then figure out patterns and ways in which we can increase that, that consumption, and therefore increase collaboration. Because the real benefit of collaboration isn't just that we have a nice, warm, and fuzzy board, but the benefit of collaboration is that you're creating knowledge and you're creating resources through greater efficiency of people actually working together. Because an individual board member can't run the whole board, right? But if you have greater collaboration, you're going to get a much more efficient results. And then finally, what you want to increase is the depth and the breadth of the network. So when we talked about social capital, when we talked about types of trust, there are two types. One is called bonded capital. Right? And bonded capital means you have really strong bonds within an organization, within a board, for example. So the board members are very closely bonded. Then you have another thing called bridging capital, which is the board members, the other association members are creating these sort of weaker ties to people outside of the board or outside of themselves. And you need both. You need to have a strong and network of close allies that you trust and you can cooperate with. You also need to bridge to lots of other members to gain trust throughout the organization. So it's not just a small clique running things. And when you have both, you get network effects. And this is the final concept that we really want to understand. Because when we get network effects through people being more engaged, and we can figure out the things that increase engagement, we compound benefits. And this is precisely why professional development and leadership training are investments. Because when we get more active and more well-trained members, particularly board members, we get greater network effects, we get greater trust within the organization. And these can be using, again, these behavioral or latent measures. The depth can be the amount of time individuals spend with specific colleagues. It can be that they attend particular meetings over and over again. This is the bonded form of measure, or bonded trust and bonded capital. The breadth is the number and the distance of contacts. So as my contacts become wider and broader, I get more trust throughout the organization because I'm more likely to get members that are engaged psychologically, that are more likely to invest tangibly, and they're more likely to trust the organization and therefore consume these professional resources to become leaders themselves. So again, to conclude, what we want to do is measure psychological, tangible, and professional engagement. We want to figure out correlations so that if we offer a certain service, we increase other sorts of engagement. And then we want to measure it both using these behavioral measures as well as what we refer to as invasive or survey measures. And then finally, all of this will get us really the holy grail, which are these network effects. We want to have deep connections in between individuals, particularly on boards, and we want to get broad connections between on a board. So even if I have a 30-person board, for example, or a 20-person board, I want to have really a close network of allies within that board, as well as trust with people I may not know as well. And over time, we build depth, we build bonds, and we get more efficient and better working organizations, both at the board level as well as at the association and the member level. I'm really happy to be able to share that with research, as well as the ability to quantify these sorts of concepts. And I'm really looking forward to the questions that folks might have.
That's great. Charles, thank you so much. This is fascinating, and as you know, you and I have had a couple of conversations where we've really gone deep on how these different ways of thinking about engagement and measuring behavior and measuring engagement can have an impact on boards. And so I have a ton of questions I want to ask you.
Sure.
We have a bunch of questions that are coming in from our participants, and just a quick reminder for those who joined us a little bit late, we will be providing a recording of this session after the fact. So I noticed a number of you have been asking questions about how to get copies of the slide deck, and so that will be provided along with the recording after today's session. But in the meantime, we hope that you'll participate actively in the conversation with Charles. I think you've raised a number of important concepts, and we went through a lot of information pretty quickly, so I'm going to start to dive a little deeper and parse that a bit. I'd love to get your questions as well. Those of you in the audience, please make sure to submit those. You can do that through the question box or through the chat window, or you can raise your hand and we'll be able to address your questions. But Charles, I want to start with a question on the last point that you made first, which was about this idea of network effects, because I think that's such an interesting concept. And I guess what I'm wondering is if we're thinking about network effects in the context of board governance and board engagement, are you making the assertion that by investing in professional development of board members, the organization could actually increase the level of the board's engagement?
Absolutely. So let's take a couple of examples. The first might be that if I run for a board seat or I'm appointed to a board seat, I'm going to hopefully know something about my responsibilities on the board. That said, we see board members who accept a board position for a variety of reasons, social prestige or other things, and they don't know simply the responsibilities of the board. So as we develop them professionally merely in terms of educating them as to the roles of the board and their responsibilities, the most basic form of education and professional development, we're going to increase their performance. A bit higher investment might be that if we develop leadership skills, for example, we send them to a seminar on how to be good leaders or on how to communicate with others. Sometimes they may have some sort of expertise, or they may actually be consuming lots of resources. They may be reading all of the board books, but they're not great at communication. Their ability to contribute is going to decline, even though they could be terrific at being able to communicate. So developing professional skills, which folks can then also, board members can then also use in their day-to-day jobs, is really important. They see benefits of it because they're becoming better at their jobs. They're developing skills. Right? And then also they're going to be better on the board. And the example again of we have a board. Let's say we have a board member who's consuming these resources, is very knowledgeable, but doesn't have great communication skills. If we offer those sorts of training sessions, we get a lot more value out of that particular board member.
And I think that's a really interesting concept, because I think in some respects that might almost run a little bit counter to conventional wisdom, right? Which is, you provide a lot of focus and a lot of professional development and a lot of opportunities for the board members who are already engaged. But you may think, well, if they're not engaged, I can't provide them any professional development because they won't show up, or it won't work, or they just won't. They're already not engaged, and so how will that help? And so I think this is a kind of turning that on its head, if I'm understanding you.
Yeah, I think it's logical to write off board members who may not be engaged in whatever way we want to define engagement, but in this case it might be attending meetings or something else. But there could be a variety of reasons they might not be attending meetings, right? Or a variety of reasons why if they're at meetings they may not be asking questions. Let's talk about asking questions for a second. Even if a board member doesn't feel comfortable sharing a presentation or sharing an opinion because they may see it as confrontational, encouraging them merely to ask questions is really important. So I teach courses at the University of Florida, and students that ask questions are benefiting all of the other students in the class, right? Because lots of people have that question to begin with. You've probably heard that phrase, right? If you have a question, definitely 10 other people have the question, right? So you're able to answer a question for lots of people and create knowledge through merely asking. And when we do encourage that, we are able to engage members at the level at which they feel comfortable. Longitudinally over time, this can also be really beneficial, because if we get people to participate and make an investment at a smaller level, or the level at which they feel comfortable, they then are more likely to participate and grow, right, and take on more responsibility once they feel comfortable. So it is important to pay attention and meet the needs of members that may not feel comfortable making these massive investments, right, or really putting themselves out there. And it also benefits them professionally. So as you benefit the board members, they may feel some level of reciprocity.
That's really interesting, and I think it goes back to something that you were talking about. You used an example of magazine members as sort of a consumption style of engagement, and I think one of the issues, of course, for those of us who work in board governance is that's exactly the style of engagement we don't want. we don't want our board members to simply be consumers of information and do nothing with that. And you use the example of if a student asks a question that benefits everyone in the class. I think we want more people to be good students and less people to be listeners. So I'm curious to know if you've got any advice of just some practical, tangible ways you can move someone up the chain from being more of a consumer style engaged person to being more of a tangible investment person.
Yeah, again, I think it's really important to meet people where they're comfortable and encourage them to share information about which they are comfortable. So let's take an example. Let's say we have a cable television engineer association. And within this association, there are lots on the board. One of the members lays the the lines for this, and they may or may not have gone to college, right? And so they're on the board, but they may feel intimidated or uncomfortable sharing opinions. But they consume all of the board resources, and they really want to be good members. Don't write them off. Right? What we want to do is know that they represent the interests of a very important constituency, that if that constituency's interests aren't represented on the board, you're going to lose lots and lots of members, right, that are paying for the association. So we want to figure out what information are folks consuming and then be able to leverage that so they're more likely to share opinions from their place of comfort. And as they do that over time, I can guarantee that they're going to build on that. Right? They won't just do it once; they will do it more than once over time, right? And they'll be and they'll build again. They'll build this trust within the association, and so that's really important.
So let's talk about the overtime for a minute, because I noticed a couple of people have asked this question, and it's a question that's on my mind as well. You know, is there any guidance around how long this takes? Like, how long does it take to really ratchet someone's level engagement up the chain? Like, what's that time horizon?
Yeah, so there, with the ASAE grant, which attempts to define and really quantify engagement, the first study of its kind, we found two ways in which to, quote unquote, engage people. The first is to expose them, and the second is to ask them. So, in fact, the best way to increase board diversity, for example, is merely to ask a more diverse array of folks to join the board. In terms of how long does it take, it can be simply one question. So if you are a board administrator, for example, or if you're another board member, merely asking somebody else about their area of expertise and a piece of information that they can share really engenders a lot of trust and communicates trust in them, and therefore engages them right off the bat. Right? Now, that it's obviously variable, and that some people, if they're asked once, might feel it might take longer to build trust for a variety of reasons. But these are people that have either volunteered for the position, or they ran for the position, or they were appointed to the position, any of these sorts of things. So they're already more likely to be leaders, right? But merely asking them to participate is the best way to at least start that process of engagement. But obviously it is variable depending on the board member. But that's the best way to start. Right.
That's great, and I think that resonates with a lot of organizations that really kind of have that sort of control over what the board development process looks like, right? They can suggest people to run for office, or they can potentially hand select people that they'd like to nominate. Mm-hmm. I'm curious to know, how does the definition of social capital change, or how does the usage of social capital change in terms of building trust with members who you really have no control over them joining your board, such as people that have been appointed or people that have been elected by the general membership about whom you know nothing? How does that definition change in that regard?
So let's talk about the two scenarios. So the first scenario would be that the board members are appointed. Well, if you're appointed, you're more likely to have this bonded form, this really close-knit, so you can think about it in sciencey terms, right, where bonds are really close-knit connections. So if the individual is appointed, they're more likely to have really internal close-knit trust with those who appointed them, rather obviously. What they need to do then is bridge out to the membership as a whole. Right? And so if you want, in that case, if you are appointing people and you're an existing board member, what you want to do, and if you want a more diverse board, is very simply ask people who may not be like you to join the board, okay? And then that's going to build bridges in addition to already engendering trust. Because if I ask you to be on the board, I'm communicating that I already trust you. So what we need to do then is build bridges to the membership group at large. If people are voted in, they have the trust of the membership. Right? So they have bridges to the membership, and they bring a really unique and beneficial skill set to the board, because they have at least the trust of a particular constituency. So what do we want to do with these board members? We want to encourage them to represent the constituency that has voted them in, and share the knowledge and share the opinions of that particular constituency. The second thing we want to do with them is, that they're voted in, is we have to build strong bonds with the other members. And this can be done in a variety of reasons. You can have retreats. You can increase the discourse within the meetings. You can have meetings that are purely sharing folks' areas of expertise. And if I share my area of expertise and my knowledge, I'm going to build trust. and I'm also going to increase the likelihood that I'm going to compromise this with somebody that isn't like me. So if you have members who are voted in, what you have is bridges to lots of different constituencies, and you have to build bonds within the association. If you have members who are appointed, you have close bonds, and what you have to do is build bridges to the membership group as a whole.
Got it. That's really, really interesting. And I think a couple of people have also asked some questions about, so let's kind of now play that out in terms of how we're building some social capital, we're building those bridges, and in one of those tactics that you mentioned, offering professional development can sometimes be a way to help to engender trust and encourage members to feel more engaged in the work of the organization. But as some folks have pointed out in their questions, offering professional development to board members can be a little bit loaded, right? Because it's welcomed when they want it. But what if it's a topic that they need professional development on and don't recognize that in themselves? And how do you walk that fine line between providing something to them that is going to help them become more engaged versus making it more repellent because you're offering them something they don't think they need? How would you navigate something like that?
Well, first, don't tell them they need it, right? don't go to somebody and say, you're a terrible communicator, we need you to take communication training. What you have to do is communicate, just like any other activity, right? These things are not terribly unique to board engagement, right? They're just like any other aspect of life, but you need to communicate the benefits that an individual will gain. So I used to teach high school debate, and these high school debaters think they're very good at communication. So what you have to communicate to them, to use the word communication over and over again, what you have to transmit to them is that maybe there are different types of communication. So let's say somebody ran for the board, they're good at communicating with their particular constituency, right? But you may want to say, learn to communicate with a diverse array of individuals, right? The people that aren't like you, and communicate the individual benefits and utility that they can gain from participating in these development activities. So a good example of building trust within the board itself, right? Within a bond, to build bonds within the board itself, might be to have everybody participate in a particular leadership activity, and then ask people who may not believe they need it, right? What to present, right? So if somebody says, I don't need this, well, say, perhaps others in the board do. Would you be willing to take some time and share your expertise? So again, it goes back to exposing individuals to an activity, and it goes back to asking them to participate. People that are on boards want to be good board members. Right? It's very rare that somebody would run and take on a responsibility and not want to actually participate.
Yeah.
And so you need to quote unquote engage them, right? By asking them to participate. This gets back at the concept of tangible engagement, because one of the measures of this tangible engagement is an investment of their time and their resources. So if I'm asking you to participate and donate your time to helping others, I'm both getting network effects, right? I'm building bonds. I'm getting greater tangible investment, which will probably lead to even more investment over time, and I'm getting more information and knowledge that can be transmitted over time as well.
Yeah, that's great. So I want to shift the focus of the conversation just a little bit, and we've been getting some really great questions from folks, and I will go back and address some of those questions here in just a moment. But I want to shift the focus a little bit to talk a bit more about psychological engagement, because I think that's a really fascinating concept, and I think that we, at least I can speak for myself as someone who's been doing board governance work for a long time. I've seen so many different examples of board engagement surveys that really never find out information about psychological engagement. They don't ever go there. They kind of ask board member preferences, they ask for board member opinions, but they don't actually ask questions that I think would probably get at the underlying issue of psychological engagement. So I'd love for you to just provide some examples. What would be questions we might add to a survey, and what would that survey instrument, how would that survey instrument be used to really gauge psychological engagement of board members?
And so I would say there are two types of questions you can ask. One is an internal psychological feeling, so a feeling towards the board and a feeling towards the association. And then the second is a behavioral measure. Would you take on a particular behavior? So So let's do the feeling one. You can ask questions like, how warm do you feel towards the association? Right? Very simple feeling questions that get at one of the conceptions of engagement, which is positivity. So you see these, for example, that people believe they engage with a brand, and every year you see the brands that are most prestigious, right, or people feel the greatest connection to them. So Google and Apple, right? People engage with these on a psychological level, in that they actually think they're a friend, for example, or the association. Another question you can ask is, do I think the association or the board has my best interests at heart, which gets at trust. Right? So we want to measure warmth, we want to measure trust, we want to measure those sorts of things, particularly trust, when we have the first measure, which is internal psychological engagement. The second would be behavioral engagement, and my favorite question for this is, would you recommend participating or contributing to this association to a friend? Because if I would recommend it to a friend, then I'm clearly endorsing it. Literally, I'm endorsing what the association, and I'm encouraging a close friend to participate, right? Which is, I think, a terrific measure, a very good measure of psychological engagement. So we have two, right? The first is an internal engagement, and the second is a behavioral engagement, feeling and endorsement.
So are you telling me that Apple is not my friend?
Well,
is that what you're telling me?
They have multiple interests, right? Being your friend is probably not at the top of the list. Although
crushing blow.
Although the good thing, if you're a brand, for example, right, about being somebody's friend is, as you build trust, you'll forgive mistakes, right? So if my computer breaks, I may be sad, right? But but if I know I can go to the store and somebody is going to give me a fair deal, right, and I think of them as my friend, I'm more likely to be a repeat customer. I'm more likely to literally give them my resources. So why do we have things like Angie's List, right, or even Yelp? It's that I know or I can see who other people think of highly, right, as friends, and I'm more likely to contribute to them. In the case of Angie's List, I'm finding a plumber, right, I'm more likely to contribute my tangible resources. I'm involved with a dog rescue organization, and I was trying to find one to participate with, and so I went along with the one that a friend recommended to me. So I feel warm toward the association internally, and I would recommend it to others. So psychologically, I demonstrate that I have a closeness to it.
So if I correlate that to Boardland, for example, an example of that might be, I serve on the board of an organization, and we've just learned that, through no fault of the organization's own, a couple of their key grant makers are going to be ending their support in the next 2 years, cutting 25% of the budget. And if I'm feeling psychologically engaged with the organization, my reaction to that as a board member is to want to roll up my sleeves and solve the problem versus wanting to head for the hills. Is that a good correlation?
Absolutely, yeah. So a good example is that not a lot of people like their cable operators, right? And this is largely due to the fact they're monopolies in certain cases. So if I get an alternative cable operator and television operator in my area, I would probably be likely to switch, because I don't believe that this operator has my best interests at heart. Whereas if the cable operator has a problem, right, or makes a mistake, I'm going to be more loyal to them because I know that they're looking out for my best interests, and I will forgive them for their mistakes. So exactly. So applying it to boards, boards don't want to be. They want to be liked, obviously, and they want to serve members, and you don't want member hostility. So for board members, it's going to be a lot more enjoyable if you've engendered trust from your association members, because mistakes are inevitable, and you want to be forgiven for them and catch a break. Right? And so engendering that level of trust is going to be more likely to have a bridge between the membership and the board. And then within the board, we have good board members who are more likely to be repeat participants.
Right. Within
the board, if you have a lot of trust within the board, right, and you view the other people as having good intentions, you might forgive them, right, for a mistake that they would make. Whereas if I believe that Tim over here doesn't have my best interest at heart, is trying to undermine me, I don't trust him. Right? If he makes a mistake, I'm going to be less likely to forgive him for it. I might be more likely to ridicule, to undermine trust, And we see lots of boards like that, right? You see a ton of boards that are dysfunctional because they don't have basic trust within them.
Right. And so, okay, so that begs a question for me, which is, let's assume for the moment that we're serving on a board where there really is a lack of trust. I mean, we've been focusing very much on the measurement, how to measure that and how to determine that, but I mean, do you have any guidance or any advice about a very simple step if there's such a situation where there really is a lack of trust? What can you do? What would be an activity that a staff member or board chair might be able to undertake to help turn that around?
That's really hard.
It's
right?
hard.
It's really difficult. One thing I would do is attempt to have board members highlight why they joined the board and their areas of expertise. And this will increase the ability to delegate responsibilities between board members. So, for example, if we'll go back to the cable television engineers, right? If in that case, the person that is an executive at one of the companies is not an expert in actually putting up cable towers, for example, right? They could learn from somebody else, and you can communicate individual benefits to it. Communicating individual benefits in a really meaningful way. That would be one way of communicating or engendering trust, because you're viewing others as having good intentions and attempting to benefit others individually. But again, that is very difficult. But that's a basic activity that somebody could undertake.
I think that's really, really helpful. I want to go back to the question for a moment of psychological engagement. We were talking about some survey questions that you could ask, and you gave us a couple of really great examples. I'd like to now ask, so let's say that we've asked those questions and we now have that information through a survey. How do we correlate that measurement of psychological engagement with tangible investment? Where are the connections we should look for?
The tangible connections between psychological engagement and then investment, right?
Yeah, so what should we look for?
The longitudinal ones are really important, right? So if I can correlate the warmth in which a board member feels for the organization with their level of tangible engagement over time, right? I might attempt to figure out ways in which I can build warmth, right? So the benefit of psychological versus tangible engagement is data over time that is longitudinal, right? And once we view these sorts of correlations and get this data, obviously it takes a while, right? We can begin to see patterns and attempt to build that up.
So you're saying rather than just looking at one particular point in time, what's more meaningful is that you're looking at how those things change over time. So you're looking, for example, how, if you were to repeat that survey every quarter, every year, whatever, you should see how the level of warmth correlates with what the board is actually doing, and you should be able to see a positive correlation.
And particular activities, right? So let's say I feel warmer, and I'm more likely to recommend others to join the association, right? That's one form. That might be the correlation and why I want to increase warmth. But I may not see a correlation between warmth and something else, right? Like donations or something like that. And if donations is my primary goal, I may not spend as much time attempting to increase warmth. I might try and communicate that you get a tangible benefit, for example, to donating.
Right. That makes perfect sense. So I want to also talk a little bit about kind of roles here, because I think we've been focusing a lot on measurement and how can we turn things around. But I'd like to see if you have any guidance in this front, which is, we're talking about a board, right? And so there's this interesting dynamic between the board and the staff. And on the one hand, you might think, well, this is, this work of building this kind of social capital and building this engagement is something that may be in the purview of staff, to help really with the care and feeding of board. But I'd like to know your opinion about, is this really truly something that the nominating committee or the board development or governance committee should own, so that it's more on a peer level as opposed to being led by staff towards board members? I'd just love your thoughts about that.
Well, it should be both. It absolutely should be both. The more senior board members should be encouraging the more junior board members to participate more. And that's usually the dynamic we see. The normal dynamic, or the most common dynamic, is junior board members or newer board members defer to the senior board. That's way of running a board, because junior, so newer, let's say newer veteran board members, right? Not older in terms of more veteran board members. Right. You want, the reason why ideas, right? They bring new, more information from the membership. They're a member of a different cohort. And so if you're a more, to be encouraging the more junior to participate more. Do is make, for example, one of the best things a staff can do is make sure, right? So they can communicate in this, I like the phrase care and feeding, right? Of board members. They can communicate what is an individual's responsibility. And frankly, although it sounds really basic, this is one of the biggest mistakes or biggest pitfalls to board members being effective. It can, one, deter people from actually running for a board seat that they may not be qualified for. They may say, well, I don't want to take on those responsibilities. So we can have a, we can prevent things like that from occurring, which is really good. Or once they're on the board, they can know their responsibilities and know where they should be directing effort. One of the reasons why people don't engage in particular activities, regardless of what that activity is, two reasons. One, they don't know what the individual benefits are. And two, they simply don't know how to accomplish the task. So what we want to do is take a big task and try and break it down, for example, into smaller activities. So if you have a board member that isn't participating and I'm a administrator, I can ask them to take on smaller and very specific tasks that would benefit. They would also benefit them as well as benefit the board. So we can give people very specific, very clear tasks. If I'm a administrator, right, that can get people engaged on a tangible level.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to know your thoughts there. So let's talk a little bit about some of the not the reported measurements that we talked about, but and the latent we could get through, for example, and actually see, for example, tasks that were assigned to them. That software can play in all engagement and measuring the engagement.
Yeah, so software is great for understanding the latent or behavioral measures. So we can take an extreme example like, so an extreme example would be something like Facebook. So, and to return to the site more. To return to the site more, right? They just between sort of post, you're returning to the site, and they show you more, et cetera, right? As an example of board effect, board software, you can very simply even online without having to ask them, did you open the board packet? Because everyone's going to say they opened the board packet. It's like going to the dentist. Did you floss, right, last month? Of course I flossed last month, right? Everybody's, or at least I don't really tell the truth when I go to the dentist, right? But the dentist, the better measure for the dentist is, are your gums bad, right? So that's the behavioral measure. So the behavioral measure is better. And in this case, it's great that we were able to use software to be able to figure out who are the board members that are highly engaged. Second, who are the board members that are not, because they're not even opening the packets, and then be able to figure out some corrective solution to encourage them to, for example, open the packet, right? And so behavioral measures are always preferred to simply asking somebody about their behaviors.
And just to be clear, I mean, and just to give one little slight correction, I mean, in Board Effect, you can see whether someone is logged into the system. Mm-hmm. You can't actually see if they've downloaded the book, but right. You can see if they've logged in, and so you can correlate if you posted the board materials 3 weeks ago and someone has not yet logged in, then clearly they haven't seen the electronic version of the board book. Right. But you can also measure other types of engagement or other types of activity, such as if you post a survey, you can see whether or not someone has responded to that survey, provided that you didn't make it anonymous. Or if you assign a task. You can find out whether or not someone has completed that task. And so how might, if I'm really thinking about this and I'm putting out a survey and I'm asking people about their level of warmth and I'm trying to gauge their psychological level of engagement, and then I look at all these latent measures of how frequently are they logging into the system and how often are they posting to a survey and how often are they completing tasks, what's a way for me to kind of take all these disparate kinds of data and different types of information and correlate that into some picture of engagement on a member-by-member basis? Do you have an approach?
Yeah, so you don't just want to look for correlations that may not matter. You want to come up with some sort of theory that that there would be a relationship between X and Y, right? So the famous example is, you know, when milk consumption increases, a particular political party wins the White House, right? Well, there's no theory as to why those things can be correlated. It's just random, and they have to be correlated, right? So you need to have a theory, right? And then you need to be able to test it. And one of the best things that you can do is then offer other sorts of activities and see if those activities, or what we refer to as an independent variable, necessarily are increasing logging in. So let's say I want people to log in 3 weeks out. Well, let's see if I send people their login information unprompted, does that increase the likelihood they're going to log in? Right, and so I can take on different tasks and I have some theory about what's going to work, and then see if that's correlated with behavior. Yeah. So, you know, I really like giving people their login credentials because I might be embarrassed that I don't know my login credentials, right? But if I'm unprompted, just if I receive them, I don't have to say, hey, you know, we think you're the sort of person that doesn't know their login credentials. It's merely saying, look, you know, here's a service we're providing. Right, and if I takeaways I hope from today, they're likely to do it. Right, so if I send you your login credentials, I ask you to log in, you're going to see many more people I guarantee it, many more people are going to be logging in because they're asked to engage in a particular activity. They've already taken on the responsibility of being a board member. If I tell them, here's one of the responsibilities of being a board member, they're more likely to log in and consume information. So if you take away nothing else, send people their login credentials and ask them to participate. And then you can ask them to participate in other activities.
That's great. That's really, really good. And someone had actually asked a question that I probably should have posed a little earlier, but I think it's okay to provide it now because it is still in context, but it was a good question. Going back to the issue of psychological engagement, which I think is the part that intrigues me the most, because I think as we've been talking about, tangible investment is probably the one thing we all have already been measuring. We've already been figuring out what's the attendance like at meetings, and are people giving us the right amount of money, and are they, you know, introducing us to their friends and so on. So we've all been measuring that. I think the psychological engagement is the fascinating part, because I don't think any of us have really been doing that. And someone asked a question, which was, isn't there a giant difference between someone's level of psychological engagement with an organization versus with the board? I think that's a really interesting concept, because you could imagine, for example, let's say that we're the board of a disease-focused organization, and I have great psychological engagement with you know, finding the cure for that disease, but that may not correlate to having a high level of engagement with the board. I'd love your thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, hopefully there's some communication between the mission of the board and knowing that this board is well functioning and the mission of the organization. So I can communicate, let's say, the converse of the negative, right? We know plenty of organizations in which the board has made serious mistakes and the organization has imploded, right? And so I want to be able to, first thing is I want to be able to communicate that. And oftentimes we say, oh, educate people or communicate with them better, and that's a catch-all, that's an easy explanation, right? But in this case, I think it really is true. You want to be able to, the board members want to have constant and clear communication between them and the association. Now, if we're talking about a well-functioning board, we want to go back to this notion of bridging versus bonded trust. So I want, within the board, I want to have a lot of trust between the different board members, because that's going to, similarly, I need to create bridge group from the board, which is between the board and the association membership. So to really specifically care about a foreign country. So I see there's an earthquake in Haiti. I really care. One of the questions I might have is, well, where do I donate? right? And there are now lots of things online, lots of metrics online for where should you be sending your money. So one of the most efficient boards is, or organizations is the Red Cross. So people are strongly encouraged to send money to the Red Cross. But the reason why isn't just that it's the Red Cross and it's been around for a while and has a beautiful building in D.C., right? The reason why is that the board has created a very efficient organization that is able to be high functioning, right? So, I think that donations is a great example because you're only going to boards that are not functioning well are not going to be engagement, because why would an organization that don't have my best interest? So you really do have bridges between the board and the association's membership group.
Might want to include. You know, would you recommend joining this organization, but also would you recommend joining this board? And you might get different answers. And I'd love for you to kind of weigh in on that and give your thoughts around that.
You might absolutely get different answers. And so the let's take a dog rescue organization, right? I might really like the mission of the organization. I might like going to the events, but I might think that the board is misusing funds. And so that's a really great psychological question in that I will get a good answer as to whether or not people feel close, and there's a real potential for a high level of engagement, but maybe it's a mistrust of the board. And that's an area where you really need to communicate better.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I have a final question here, which is it's interesting. It came in from one of our participants, but it's actually something that I was interested to ask you, which is, you know, so look, what we hear a lot from our clients and from our members that work with Board Effect is, you know, we are focused on board engagement, we're providing professional development, we're doing a lot for the board, and we just can't get them to bother to show up or be engaged. And even if they love the organization, they're super into the mission, they just absolutely do not fulfill their role as a board member.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you have any just maybe parting words of wisdom for those that work in this field, you know, a place to start. You know, measuring the engagement, I think we have some ideas there, but what if we can't even get them to respond to a survey? So
right.
Just some thoughts about what can you do?
Well, it's admittedly very difficult, right? And it's probably the biggest and hardest problem, right, that boards, that board administrators have. The best tip that I can give you is to attempt to recruit board members who you think are going to be more likely, who are going to be more likely to be participatory board members. And the best way I know of doing this is to communicate the responsibilities of board members prior to them running for the board. Right? So during an election, when you have a call for candidates, for example, if it's an election board, or if the board members are decided via election, really emphasize and communicate, here are the 3 things we need. We still have this problem, right? People may on the board regardless. Right? But the best thing I know how to do, and that I've seen from a number of different associations, is to try and really communicate prior to the election the types of board responsibilities that individuals may have. Second, the thing that you can do is attempt to groom board members from the time they join the organization about these responsibilities of the board. So, for example, one of the associations we're working with for the it has a great program where they have college clubs associated with the organization. So people from college, right, who haven't even entered the career yet, are getting information about the association and the responsibilities of the board. So they go to a college conference, right, and that's a great opportunity to educate them about what board members should be doing, right? And they are young professionals, and they may have maybe a young professional representative on the board. It's another great opportunity to educate them about what the board may do. So if you have these career paths, right, or if you have the ability to institute an educational program over time, that's another great way of doing this. But is there an immediate fix? Probably not. right? And that's an unfortunate answer.
It's something that has to happen over time.
Right. But the immediate, hopefully immediately you can say, send out a tweet. You know, we really need, and really asking people, we really need to strengthen the organization and communicate to them. Because if they're highly active and highly engaged in terms of donations and other things, they want the organization to succeed. So merely sending out a tweet to them, saying we really need for the organization to succeed, you to take on actions X, Y, and Z, which again you may already be doing, is the fastest and most efficient and shortest term way, immediate term way of really building that. So again, very difficult. I definitely empathize with boards that have that problem. So if it's an appointed board, right? Again, ask them. There are two things. One is that for the appointers, people who are doing the appointing, really try and communicate to them the sort of board members you need and communicate why you need them. So you can give them a case study on successful boards, for example, that they may read and say, wow, I need these sorts of representatives. So again, grooming good board members over time, and then communicating the responsibilities to existing board members who may be doing the appointing.
Right. Well,
but it's difficult.
It is difficult.
I mean, all this stuff is very difficult.
Well, and admittedly, our mission today was not so much to fix all of the dysfunctional boards on Earth, but rather at least to help people understand ways they could measure the function of their boards. And from that measurement, then there's lots of other things that can be done to try to move the needle, albeit slowly and albeit perhaps over a period of attrition and new election. That may very well be the case.
And that's a great, with the example of board members who are donating a lot. I mean, it's not a terrible problem to have, right? You want people, at least you're getting something out of your board members. Now you just need to shift to a different form of engagement, right? But you know where the strengths are, which is good, but you also know where your weaknesses are. And I think some of these tools, some of these survey tools, for example, are going to be good, at least learning where the strengths are and where the issues are.
Great. Well, Charles, I want to, that brings us right to the top of the hour here, and I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your research with us, and we'll be interested to see what else you have written in the coming years. We know that you're doing a lot of work, and we're really looking forward to seeing how that research plays out. All of you on the phone, thank you so much for your great questions. Thank you so much for participating in this webinar, and thank you again, and have a really wonderful day. Thank you again.
It's really my pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, take care.